To discuss this, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by Riley Walters. He's a policy analyst specializing in Asian economies at conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation. In New York is the director of the China National Association of International Studies, Victor Gao. And in Singapore, we have Steve Okun. He's a former deputy general counsel in the U.S. government during Bill Clinton's administration. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Steve Okun, let me begin with you. So China and the U.S. after G20 are saying, let's take a 90-day breather on tariffs and make nice for now. It's better than it was before, isn't it? Aren't we less close to the U.S. and China clashing?
No, we're still having a U.S.-China clash. The U.S. still has $250 billion in tariffs on China. Those did not go away. $50 billion at 25%, $200 billion at another 10%. We have a pending $267 billion that was threatened to go into effect January 1. That's the only thing that's been postponed. The core issue from the U.S. perspective is China's unfair trade practices when it comes to IPR. That hasn't been resolved. Maybe it will get resolved. I'm not optimistic it's going to be done in this 90-day period. So I don't see us as having a truce right now.
And so, Steve, have they just kicked the can down the road to deal with come spring 2019?
I don't know that they've necessarily. I don't think they've kicked the can. I think what they've done is said, let's see what's going to happen in this 90-day period. This 90 days gives the Chinese a sense of urgency, the U.S. administration, that something concrete needs to get done. And if it doesn't, the potential for $267 billion in additional tariffs comes, as well as the increase from 10 to 25% on the existing $200 billion in tariffs. So it really didn't kick the can. It's given it a little bit of time for discussion, but there's still a hard deadline on it. And let's see if the Trump administration holds to the rule of law under Section 301 of the United States.
Okay, so Victor Gao, according to the agreement that came out of Argentina, if at the end of this period the parties are unable to reach an agreement, the 10% tariffs will be raised to 25%. So do you agree with Steve that the ball is in the Chinese court now? They have to show the Americans that they're serious about sorting this out?
Now, first of all, what came out of Argentina is a good news for China. It's a good news for the United States. It's a good news for global economy. So we need to congratulate President Trump and President Xi Jinping of the two countries for taking the right thing. To put a halt to whatever that happened in the trade war between the two countries and to enable the two government teams to negotiate with each other. Secondly, talking about the trade war and the tariffs, there is no joy in the tariffs to be charged. It's bad for China. It's bad for the United States. If, for example, in the worst case scenario, if the United States keeps charging all these tariffs, the U.S. economy will suffer, the U.S. consumers will suffer, the U.S. farmers will lose out. That's a fact. We need to realize that. If anyone in the United States takes great joy in charging tariffs, I think they need to wake up, whatever, face the reality. Tariff is the worst thing for the United States in the philosophical sense and in the practical sense. I think the Chinese leadership need to be congratulated for keeping calm, keeping sanity, not losing temper, and in dealing with the United States as it is. No one likes tariffs. The Chinese government is not paying the money to be charged by the U.S. government. 50% of the Chinese export to the rest of the world are made by foreign companies operating in China, including companies from the United States.
Okay, so
they now ask the U.S. government to forget about charging more tariffs.
Yeah, let me take a part of that and pose it to Riley Walters. Riley, Victor Gao saying, you think tariffs are good for anybody here? I mean, it's kind of ironic in a way that we're in 2018, and I guess for any students of 20th century history to see the U.S. being, I don't know, more protectionist and the Chinese being more globalist and internationalist here. Is Victor Gao making a good point here?
Well, I think there's one person who really likes tariffs, and that's President Trump. No, I agree with him to a certain extent. Tariffs are not effective in achieving their intended goals. They definitely create a lot of cost for both U.S. and Chinese consumers. They create a lot of inefficiency in the market. And, I don't really think, we needed tariffs to get to where we are right now in the negotiation process. What came out of Argentina, I think it is a step in the right direction. Of course, the next 90 days are going to be tough, but they were always going to be tough. 2 years ago, U.S.-China negotiations were going to be tough, no matter what they were going to look like. But I think for now, what we got out of Saturday was at least a sign that, we can start making the steps in the right direction.
Steve Okun, a lot of people know what a military war looks like. They can envision it. What does a full-blown trade war look like? What happens if they can't come to an agreement come the spring of 2019? Describe what a full-blown trade war between the US and China will look like.
Well, the issue is you have to start with why the tariffs are there. The tariffs are there because the United States believes that China engages in unfair trade practices. Look at Made in China 2025. Look at China's policies to force technology transfers. Look at China's state-driven economy, which gets an unlevel playing field for all businesses, not just U.S. businesses. So what the Trump administration has done is said, we're going to use tariffs as our best lever to address those issues. I think all three of us will agree that tariffs are not the way to address those issues, and that there's other ways to get everybody together to address the core problem. And so what's going to happen is if the U.S. and China cannot come to an agreement, the U.S. then has two choices, and this is an agreement on whether China is going to modify its state-driven economy. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if that's realistic. If that doesn't happen, then the U.S. is going to have to decide, do we stay with tariffs and clearly harm ourselves, but we think we're going to put more pressure on China, or does the U.S. move to a more multilateral framework, try and fix the WTO, trying to get to these 21st century trade issues, maybe come back and join the TPP, which the Trump administration never should have left. That's what the U.S. is going to have to decide if after this 90-day period, China isn't going to change the way the U.S. wants China to change.
Victor Gao, there's a feeling from the Americans, fundamentally, that the Chinese don't play fair. And this is from Republicans and Democrats. The Chinese are not playing fair. This is an uneven playing field, as we heard from Steve. How do the Chinese feel about that? What's their response?
Well, first of all, look at what the Trump administration has been accusing of a whole bunch of other countries, including China. They are accusing these countries of all kinds of things. Now, when we zoom in on the U.S. government's accusation of China in terms, for example, IPR violation and forced transfer of technology, give me one single example of forced transfer of technologies by China and transferred to China by foreign multinationals. No, I think these foreign multinationals are very sophisticated players. They have their own protection about their fundamental interest in their IPR rights. And I don't think you have any real concrete example of forced transfer of technologies to the Chinese companies endorsed by the Chinese government. So when we talk about IPR protection, we all need to protect IPR rights, including the Chinese government, including the Chinese companies. And we welcome the United States and the U.S. companies to work with China to help us to provide better protection to IPR rights. China, after all, now produces more IPR rights than any other country in the world. It is in China's own interest if we get to know IPR protection better, and if we do a better job in IPR protection. Now, you asked about the trade war.
Right. Okay, go ahead. Finish your point. Yeah, what will it look like,
You asked about the trade war.
Yeah.
A total trade war between China and the United States will be probably a devastating blow to international trade. And the world, after the Chinese-American trade war, will be someone we no longer understand. So American leaders and the Chinese leaders should be both aware of the dire consequences of a full-blown trade war between China and the United States. It's not good for China. It's bad for the United States. It's bad for the whole world. Okay,
so Riley Walters, I'm not going to treat Victor Gao as a spokesman for the entire country, but I think in many ways he provides the rationalization and the type of thinking behind the Chinese business and political practice vis-a-vis the world. How does that square with you when you look at how the Chinese do business and how they express their soft power as well? Does he make sense?
I think what he's touching at is sort of the benevolent government idea, the idea that, just because you're working for the government, that doesn't mean there aren't corrupt officials. It's the private businesses who are scheming to, create a competitive advantage for themselves to the detriment of either, the Chinese economy or the Chinese government. I don't necessarily believe this is true. We have seen laws. There are laws in the book that require joint venture requirements for American companies. the transfer of intellectual property. We have, surveys that say, U.S. companies are not necessarily explicitly, but implicitly, it's implied that they have to transfer technology when they either sign into a joint venture, or if one day someone comes a knocking, you're not sure whether they're a party official who can make or break your company in China. And so what USTR has raised on the Section 301 tariffs, these are real complaints. There are a lot of these things. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say it's $600 billion worth of year of intellectual property theft. Even USTR themselves thinks that the annual cost to U.S. businesses is around $50 billion. But I think going forward, there are a lot of improvements. We don't necessarily need China's involvement in this to make a lot of these sort of fixes that we want to see. We can do more unilateral and multilateral things with or without China.
And Steve Okun, you mentioned that the U.S. might take a multilateral approach, might try to reform the World Trade Organization or do things through that institution. But given that in Buenos Aires, we heard Trump mention once again that he's got a plan to get out of NAFTA. He's a man who doesn't like these international institutions. Any international institution with an acronym Trump doesn't like. So what's the likelihood that the U.S. is going to work with these international institutions in order to solve this?
Well, what's happening, certainly sitting here in Singapore and seeing what's happening in Asia, is that countries aren't waiting for the U.S. to act, and they're not waiting for China to act. It's why the Comprehensive Partnership for the Trans-Pacific Partnership has gone forward, the CPTPP, a free trade agreement of 11 countries. It goes into effect at the end of the year. Because we as businesses across Asia, we need trade agreements that represent what is doing business in the 21st century, that get to IPR protection, that get to level playing fields with state-owned enterprises, that address environmental issues and labor issues and cross-border data flows and all of that. And so people move forward without the U.S., without China. We're not in a world anymore where it's going to be the U.S. leads or China leads. We're voting, people are voting, businesses are voting, governments in Asia are voting to move on their own. It's going to be a lot more difficult. It's going to be a lot slower. But that's where the world's going as the U.S. and China are engaged in this battle, which does not seem to be ceasing or have a truce anytime soon.
Victor Gao, long story short, is the U.S. just jealous that you guys are getting in on the act?
Now, I think many in China are confused as to what exactly the United States is up to. If they are really caring for the trading balance between China and the United States, then we have a lot to talk about. Trading balance between China and the United States is not good for the United States. It's also not good for China. We need to make the trade more balanced between the two countries. If the United States is really worried about Chinese economy eventually becoming bigger than that of the United States, you cannot stop it. It's getting bigger. And China one day will be larger than the United States economy. And that's a mega trend. You cannot fight against that. You need to come to terms with that prospect. It may happen in 5 years, 10 years or 15 years, but it's happening. So Americans need to wake up to that reality. You cannot stand in the way of a big mega trend. Otherwise, it will be buried by the mega trend.
Okay.
So what exactly is the American up to? I think if we know that better between China and the United States, we can engage each other in a more realistic way. We can come up with all the good solutions which will work for China and will work for the United States. The world today no longer wants to have a bully on the block. The United States and the American people at their heart are decent people.
Okay,
and the
but what's interesting is the Americans are saying you guys are bullying in terms of trade.
I think we can get along.
Mr. Gao, yeah, I've got to wrap. The interesting thing is the Americans are saying you guys are doing the bullying here. There's a 3-month period now, and it's going to be fascinating to see because I guess there's going to be a bit of game theory going on and second guessing on both sides. But for the moment, a cautious optimism coming out of Buenos Aires. Gentlemen, I thank you for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Riley Walters, Victor Gao, and Steve Okun.